Hello, I am not Barbara Hall. But I've worked with Barbara on 2 of her series that you heard in my bio, Joan of Arcadia, and now currently Madam Secretary. And Barbara and I both agreed this was a great clip to start with because we both feel like it's the gold standard for what you want to try to bring in a pop culture, film, television conversation about faith, about tangling with the big questions. Because what we love about that scene is it acknowledges both sides, it legitimates both sides, and it allows them to really talk to each other and tangle. It brings everyone in, which is a theme you're going to hear me return to a lot. And that more than anything, Barbara and I, both in gathering our thoughts for this talk, agreed that that's the mission, to try to bring everybody into this conversation. Religion on TV is usually simplistic or superficial, it can be. People don't want to go deep. It's not cool. They might catch it. I was thinking about the story that I was so delighted to hear that Diane loved. I loved it too, Switched at Birth. It was a lovely, small family teen show where we included deaf actors and their deafness was not the point. Except, you know, occasionally when it organically was, but mainly it was just, here are some deaf people. They're flawed. They're humans. They fall in love. They break each other's hearts. They're mean to their mom sometimes. And it was a lovely, tolerant, open-hearted show. It's one I'm very proud of. And yet, I will say, I had a shocking moment when we talked about a Christian character on the show, and I and another writer, Becca Brunstetter, started advocating for like authentic stories about a person of faith. And there was quite a bit of resistance in the room full of my liberal, tolerant brethren. The words I would say, I was listing the reactions I got: skepticism, distaste, pity, rejection, horror. So there's a resistance. There's a resistance in the atheist world that we have to overcome when we want to talk about these big questions and faith and spirituality. It's a shocking blind spot in people who preach and practice tolerance in many other areas of their lives. So religion too often doesn't work well on TV because it's either preaching to a choir or it's trying to reach people who already have decided that's not me, I feel left out of the discussion, like Mark Ruffalo's character Terry here. And the trick, if that's the right word, is trying to find a way to reach out and include those who normally don't identify as a person of faith, and bring them into the conversation, which I think Kenneth Lonergan wrote and directed that film. He's a beautiful playwright, and he's playing the priest in that scene. And he wrote and directed this film, You Can Count on Me. I thought he just found a lovely way to include those who identify with faith into the conversation. So I began in theater, member of the Looking Glass Theater Company in Chicago. And my first play, you know, it has a sort of like Jungian significance when you wake up from a dream and you think it's random, and then it's only later that, of course, it seems thuddingly obvious. But my first play that I just thought, oh, I just read this interesting book about the lives of saints, and I'll write a play that's beautiful movement sequences and images, but it was based on the lives of Catherine of Siena, Saint Catherine of Siena, and Saint Therese of Lisieux. And it's only in retrospect that I can see I was tangling with the dichotomy that those two saints' lives exemplify. Saint Catherine of Siena being the sort of mythic, heroic saint who, you know, the lives of the saints are full of these almost insane-sounding quests and tasks and deprivations that they endure. And contrasting that with Saint Therese of Lisieux, who is called the Little Flower. She lives in a very different world from Catherine of Siena, a different century. She went into the convent at a very young age and died at a very young age, doubting her faith. And I can see in this play, my first play, that I was tangling with the tension between the external life of faith and the internal, flawed, terrified, doubtful life of faith. And the tension between those journeys compels me to this day in my storytelling. I was raised Catholic, and I've always identified with Jacob wrestling with the angel. I might be more Judeo than Christian in my preference for sort of questions, rabbinical questions, over a sort of acceptance of mystery. Not only is a matched fight between conflicting ideologies just good drama, it's also a way to engage more people in the conversation. So I'm always looking for the fight. Where's the fight, the tension between these warring ideologies? And I think Barbara might say instead, I'm looking to throw a bigger party. It was interesting to me to think back on my career thus far in television and sort of take inventory. Where did I start to bring my wrestling with angels to my work? And I could see so clearly my first attempt to do it on my first job, which was on a dramedy called Felicity. And it's about a young woman, nominally it's about a young woman caught between two boys, but literally it's about a young woman trying to become herself, which was the part I was most interested in. And so I was very quiet my first year in a writer's room. It's very intimidating. But I managed to find my voice 2/3 of the way through the first season and pitch an astonishing fact that I had discovered, which is that the greatest source to this day of scholarship money for women in the United States is beauty pageants. So I thought, what if we give Felicity some tuition crisis and she finds herself having to enter a beauty contest? To my delight and shock, the whole room lit up and they said, that's so fun, that's a great standalone, we say in the business, a single episode. And I was so hopped up on the helium of having my first idea sort of catch fire that I got really excited and started, I am a feminist and I love dressing up. So I started wrestling with that angel. What if there's another woman who's in the beauty pageant but feels objectified by it, and they come up with an alterna pageant and it's like for differently abled people, and I got so excited, and we broke for lunch, and then when we came back from lunch, I was taken aside by two of the upper level women writers, and it was explained to me that I was perhaps too passionate about this issue. So it was a while before I was able to carve out space for myself to bring my contradictions and my convictions to my work as a television writer. Yeah, yes, I have to earn that. But I was lucky enough in my second job to work with Barbara Hall, who staffed me on her CBS drama, Joan of Arcadia, which was a show entirely about arguing with God. In it, God, the device, for those who may not be familiar with the show, is God appears to a teenage girl. She's not sure why she's been chosen, and the delightful device of the show is that God always appears to her in the guise of completely ordinary people, and it's only in talking to them that she realizes, oh, it's you again. And I loved one of the first things Joan says when she begins to accept that this cute boy, God, who speaks to her in the pilot, it really is who he says he is. And she says, well, you've got some explaining to do. And that's what the show was interested in. So in the show, he gave her assignments and maddeningly oblique explanations for what the point of the assignment was, which never was obvious. But mostly he threw back questions to her. And it is to date my favorite show of those that I've worked on. I spoke with Barbara about her mission with Joan of Arcadia. And she spoke so beautifully about the beauty and complexity of theology. How hard it is to find that on television because people don't want to look at it. Go back to the uncool factor. And you have to find other ways to bring them into the beauty of it. And her strategy with Joan of Arcadia was to talk about God through quantum physics, which was her obsession at the time. One of my favorite lines, in the show, God is a bit of a physicist too. One of my favorite lines that Barbara wrote for God, she ended up engraving on a silver clock, a mantle clock, for all of the writers for our first season gift, and I still treasure it. And God says to Joan, all magnetic fields are the same. All carbon atoms are the same, as are all protons, neutrons, and electrons. It didn't have to be that way, but it makes the universe beautiful. Who would care about the universe being beautiful but a divine, benevolent entity? So when I joined the show at its beginning, Barbara had us reading quantum physics books, particularly one called God at the Speed of Light, which was examining how the behavior of photons under certain circumstances is unexplainable and therefore beautiful, and I think Barbara would say, and therefore divine. So she talked about the intersection of physics and metaphysics, and she talked about how after Joan premiered, she got feedback from 2 of her intellectual atheist friends who said, I love this show, and she realized in that moment, it was her aha moment, that's who I'm writing this show for. So bringing them in to the beauty of this new cosmology. So Barbara's project was to reinvent and reimagine religion in a conversation with the mysteries of physics. And she said to me, dogma and scripture doesn't speak to people. She wanted to deconstruct and put back together a cosmology through another lens. I'm going to show you a clip from, Jim, let's do that first clip from Joan of Arcadia. This is from an episode I wrote called The Uncertainty Principle. And I'll show 2 scenes, but I'll pause between scenes to give Jim a chance to cue it up the second one. So I started thinking, well, I want to say more, one last thing about that. I just love writing for broadcast TV because we get to cast a broad net and bring so many people into a conversation about big ideas in a pop culture context. After Joan of Arcadia, other examples of tangling with my spirituality and my television writing diminish for quite a long stretch in the middle there. I was racking my brains thinking, okay, well, in Jericho, which is about a post-apocalyptic small town, Skeet Ulrich kind of leads a band of rebels trying to bring back the good United States and in conflict with the nascent fascist in the next town over. That's good versus evil, right? But I realized the battle between good and evil is so shop-worn, so internalized in us, it doesn't even bear mentioning in this context. But good versus evil is, of course, a fundamentally Christian notion. And where my mind goes instead, and this is not something I wrote, but I thought of a moment that blew my mind at a dinner party. It was a conversation with a friend. We both had 4-year-old kids at the time, and we were talking about how much we love Hayao Miyazaki's animated classic, My Neighbor Totoro. And I was saying, I love that film so much because there's no story, really. There's a loose collection of events that aren't necessarily connected, and yet I'm utterly compelled. And my friend casually answered, oh, well, that's because it's a Buddhist movie. It's not a Christian movie. It's just about the life cycle. And it was a moment of me realizing there is a whole other way to construct stories. It reminded me of something Barbara said when we were first working on Joan of Arcadia and trying to get us to understand how elusive the divine is. She said, we are fish who don't know there's land. And I felt in that moment like a fish who's been living in Judeo-Christian storytelling who glimpsed like, oh my God, there's a world up there with a vast number of species that I've never encountered. So I have one clip I want to show. This is the DVD, Jim, when you're ready. One clip to demonstrate this. I'll quickly set it up. 2 young sisters and their father moved to the Japanese countryside in an old house. Their mother is sick and she's convalescing away from the girls. And they're living in an old house where these magical glittering acorns occasionally fall from the ceiling and other magical things happen. Before this clip, the younger sister had wandered into the woods where she meets a giant benevolent creature that he tells her his name is Totoro. It's totally unexplained. And then the girls plant the acorns, and then this magical moment happens, which is one of my favorite moments, perhaps in all of film. And I'd love to share it with you. I'm probably not going to let it play to its full length because it's a little long. I'm deeply fortunate to be again working with Barbara Hall on Madam Secretary and talking about the kind of simplistic trap of good versus evil. I found a way in an episode I'd like to share a piece of with you to take on the thorny dilemma of evil. In the sort of ever equivocating world of, grad school world where my brain got sort of set, I rarely like to land on anything too firmly or definitively, and so it was sort of a shock at first when Barbara said, I think in context of a Joan of Arcadia episode, evil is real. There's evil. Some people turn that way, and it's evil. And so I thought, I want to confront Madam Secretary with real evil. She's a foreign ambassador, foreign ambassador, the chief ambassador. So there's no shortage of evil things that she encounters, but we rarely see it get to her. She's a former CIA analyst. She's toughened herself, but I wanted her to have a crushing defeat, and I wanted our audience to see that our hero is fallible, and I wanted her staff to be overwhelmed, unable to metabolize what has happened. So in an episode, we took on human trafficking, the ongoing horror, and gave us a figure inspired by Kayla Mueller, who was a Christian aid worker who was kidnapped by ISIS, and the United States was not able to negotiate for her release. She was raped and tortured, forced into a marriage with an ISIS leader, and eventually killed in an airstrike. So melding these two horrors in our world, I confronted Madam Secretary to attempt to save such an aid worker caught up in human trafficking. But her captors are tipped off by police, and the captors get away, and the aid worker is found in a truck with all of the other girls who were also captured, all of them dead from asphyxiation. The staff is traumatized, and the final scene that I'm going to share with you, Megan, when you're ready, sorry, let me finish setting it up, and then I'm going to need your help. The final scene was inspired by two events in the writer's room. One day after lunch, I can't remember what prompted it, we began getting on, because we're looking for any excuse to not talk about the story that's hanging over our heads. Someone decided to read their favorite poem, and it led to all of us looking up our favorite poems online, and very soon we were all weeping and deeply moved and broken open, and I felt like we're in the presence of the divine. Poetry is the divine speaking to us. And then I was also inspired by a very different moment on the day after the 2016 election, when we gathered in one of our offices and could not function and felt deeply, that we felt our country had fallen into a moral disaster, and we were traumatized. So in this scene, you'll see Madam Secretary and her staff struggling with the loss of faith and what brings them some small measure of grace. So Megan? So for Barbara, inviting everyone to the discussion is the mission statement of her show. And it's why we've never declared a political affiliation for Madam Secretary's administration. So the audience can listen to all different kinds of ideas. It helps us point out that ideas do have crossover, so people can come together and spend time with other ideas and other cultures, and for an hour once a week be somewhat unified. At a time when our country seems to be pulling back from the world, we want to have a time when 9 million of us can open up our world a little bit and be with each other and ask some questions, share some sorrow, and wrestle with some angels. Thank you.
Hello, yep. Okay, I was telling Joy that was fabulous, and we so much appreciated her presentation. We have time for 5-10 minutes of questions. I have a few here, but if there's something that you'd like to ask her, write it down, pass it to the sides, and we'll give it a go. So, first of all, and whoever wrote this, I'm totally in agreement with it. Thank you for creating a religion professor as a main character. Yeah.
I have to jump in and say, Barbara created a clip reel, which was just, it plays like the Tim Daly, clip reel from his agents, because it's just one scene after another of him saying overtly Christian stuff on the air all the time. But I wanted to get into something a little more, less obvious about what I feel is tangling with the bigger issues.
So are there any religious topics or groups that you won't touch?
Any topics or religious groups?
Yeah.
Well, I will say we are under directions never to acknowledge that North Korea exists on the show. That's one political hot button issue. We just don't want to go there. North Korea, we just don't ever utter the words North Korea. That's an untouchable. Other than, a regime that has literally attacked the United States over pop culture, I would say nothing has been off limits. And in fact, we've gone where we knew we would be controversial. We acknowledged that President Dalton took a stand against climate change denial, and this was very controversial with some of our viewers. I'm trying to think of another. There was another issue we took on. Well, I would also say that we tend to avoid, this has been a blanket statement for every show I've been on, don't go into the abortion debate. Like the really entrenched issues that are going to be so hot button and everyone already knows what they think about it. That's an issue we avoid, but that's also true of almost every show I've been on. I can't think of many, though. We've gone to a lot of places, and as long as we're fair, and we have wonderful consultant group that keeps us honest about politics and honoring the complexity of the issues that we take on.
Deadline Hollywood says TV producers are trying to reach folks who voted for Trump, and one way of doing that is by putting more religion on television, like Living Biblically and By the Book. So do you think this is true, and do you think it will succeed?
Well, I would go back to sort of my theme of my talk, which is we want to engage and unify as much as possible. This being said, we did another controversial episode where we overtly took on the 25th Amendment when President Dalton started calling for a completely unjustified act of aggression against Russia, which his entire cabinet objected to. And, that was us taking on an issue in the air, not necessarily coming down on one side or the other, but certainly not. I don't think that Trump supporters felt warm and fuzzy about that episode. But I will say that, again, we don't overtly seek to alienate anyone, but we do respond to the issues that are in the air right now. And I would say climate change is one where we did sort of dare to really come down on a position that we knew was going to be alienating to certain people. So I would say, is religion a way that we're reaching out to? That's certainly, that's not explicitly our mission, but it is implicitly our mission to reach out to as many Americans as possible at a time when we really need it.
To follow up on that, do you have any sense of your demographics? So would you know if Trump voters or non-Trump voters are among your audience?
Well, it's an inexact science. I like to follow our message boards on our Facebook page, and I go to a few other places, particularly after an episode that I think might ruffle some feathers. And we also brought in a transgender new member of Madam Secretary's staff, and that was controversial as well. So I would say that our audience is positively mixed, and we love that and embrace that and value it. We're always relieved when it feels like the intolerant views, like I don't never want to watch again because that woman is dressed like a man, that they're sort of outnumbered by people saying, hey, take a breath, it's okay. So I would say we skew liberal, but or tolerant, I should say, but our age spectrum is pretty wide and tilts toward older viewers, and we love that too.
Do you think your writing room is unusual in Hollywood? Do you think many writing rooms have people who are so thoughtful about poetry and religion and physics.
That's
I mean, it's not what we usually think of as a writing room.
Right, right. I have to say, I love the company of writers. And when I was on the very sweet, some would say soft, family show Switched at Birth, my colleagues were just as intellectually engaged. We had passionate talks about elections and politics. It's pretty across the board in TV writers, but it may be that my interests tend to get me staffed on staffs that with shows that are, well, dramas tend to have more thoughtful people, although it is such a delight to work. There are a few writers I've worked with who are equally experienced in comedy. They're so entertaining. I just love them. That's sort of like the most diverse, that's the diversity card in my world. Oh, a less thoughtful person who's just hilarious.
But do you think there's a certain amount of intentionality about what are we saying and how are we saying it and how this is going to make a difference in national conversation?
Yes, absolutely, yes. I would say we were holding our breath a little bit because I have a friend who is, he sort of represents the right to me. I made a despairing post on Facebook after the election. Oh my gosh, I guess I need to listen to the other side. I need sane voices from Trump supporters to explain the right side of the political spectrum to me. And my friend Ken Kurson, who is a speechwriter for Rudy Giuliani, and actually wrote Trump's speech about Israel, or helped him with it. You know, he weighed in and said, "At your service, Joy." So he came at me a little bit before the election saying, "Come on, your show is a commercial for Hillary. She even looks a little like an idealized Hillary." I think Hillary looks pretty ideal already. And so we were holding our breath thinking, gosh, if Hillary does not win this election, or honestly, whichever way it goes, people are so fed up with the dynamics of this election. How is this going to affect the show? We've been thrilled to find that we've become a point of relief for people who don't like the chaos of what's been happening the first year of this administration. Wherever you are on the spectrum, we're a picture of a functioning government that it wants to be in the world, where nobody's on Twitter, and so we are trying to create a point of relief for those who seek it.
And one last question. What do you think needs to happen for Hollywood to put more people of color and non-Christians on shows?
People of color and?
Non-Christians. People who aren't Christian?
Yes. Aren't there plenty of them? No. Oh, I see. People of other faiths.
Yeah.
Because I thought you meant just atheists, because they're running the show. Other faiths and other colors. Yes, of course. I always have Gina Davis in mind whenever we pitch a character. Gina Davis, I'm blanking on the name of her wonderful organization, but she tries to drill the message into writers' heads. Every time you think of a character, just make it a woman. Just make it a person of color. It doesn't have to change anything. So we very effortfully try to diversify all of the roles on the show. I feel like the conversation that's happening right now can only make things better, if only because people are now scared, and that's what it takes. Where we're trying to do our part. And I see improvement overall. But in terms of people of other faith, because she is a diplomat, we have lots of opportunities to talk to other cultures and personify them and give them a point of view and give them another half of the debate, and that's thrilling.
I would like to take this opportunity to tell you thank you so much for filling in. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
We're so grateful.
Just think, what if we didn't have local TV and radio? Where would I go for local sports, local politics, a mayor, city council, stuff that affects me every day? How about health? Who's covering things that endanger my family? I need to know now, as it happens, from sources I trust, people in my community. No agenda, no bias like you find on cable and social media, just facts. For news I can trust, I stay local. Support your local station. Text TV to 52886 today.